Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to Jericho Road. In this season 3, we're looking at the world of Jesus as it is told in the Gospel of Mark. And hopefully, we can get you looking at this greatest story ever told in a new way. These days, around the congregation, I've been talking about starting points. We always need to check our starting points because where we start has everything to do with where we end up. And I think starting points can also get our minds around the excitement of Jesus in the Galilee. For starters, a starting point would be their religion in their world, or for the Hebrew people. The Galilee was a place populated with Jewish cities that kept Jewish customs and Jewish Sabbath, for instance, and Jewish food, but they also had lots and lots of Gentile neighbors, and they tried to stay pure and apart. That's an important point to think about when you think about the land or the world of Jesus. Travel there today and you'll find lots of beautiful Roman cities, places like Tiberias or Scythopolis. You could find Greek city-states like Hippos. I mean, you can find places that Jesus just wouldn't go to, and they're magnificent ruins, but they're either not mentioned in the Bible or Jesus steered clear because they all steered clear. They tried to make themselves different in the way that the Bible asked them to be different, and so that's their starting point, their religion. There were places you just didn't go until he did. So part of the drama of the gospel is we read these places and we just think they're all Bible places, but some of these are confusing if you know a little bit of the history, and that's what we're going to try to do today is unpack a little bit of a mystery of why Jesus traveled to Caesarea Philippi. If you didn't go to Scythopolis, why did he go here? I'm going to begin with a photograph. This is actually an archaeological dig that's ongoing. It's called Tel Omrit, and it's about 2.5 miles from what would be the center of Caesarea Philippi and a shrine to Pan. It's on the outskirts of the villages of Caesarea Philippi. I want to say something, too, about the land itself. When we talk about the Bible really doesn't mention how fantastically biodiverse Judea it was and continues to be as the nation of Israel. So, for instance, the land of Judea, the biblical borders of the land, the world of Jesus, is about the same as the nation of Israel today, which is about the size of our state of Alabama. So I want you to imagine our state of Alabama sitting on 3 tectonic plates, so that the city of Birmingham would be the northern tip of Africa and then go about 30, 40 miles north of there on either side of the Jordan River, and you'd have Europe on one side and Asia on the other, which means that the Sea of Galilee would have in it African fish and African plants and African things, flora and fauna, African animals. But then just a few, right, an hour's north drive, you've got cherry trees and brook trout. Fascinating place. And so we're told in the 8th chapter of Mark that Jesus and his friends travel north. So I'm showing you a picture of a tel. It's called Tel Omrit, and it's ongoing, and it's an altar, and it's huge. I want to show you a second picture with me standing by one of the columns so that you get a sense of the scale. It is ornate, it's beautiful, and it's sat on the historic road to Damascus. Now, I play a little game with my friends when we travel over there that I call a get. And a get is when you can find something in Scripture and then find something Jesus touched, or find something where a Bible story happened, right? Well, this would be a get because it's on the road to Damascus, which means that St. Paul would have ridden by this on his way to Damascus and then experienced his conversion, so that's a get. And Jesus would have ridden by this as he rode into the villages of Caesarea Philippi in Mark chapter 8. It's a very Roman place, and as I mentioned, Galileans, with their starting point of their religion, would ordinarily avoid a place like this. A Roman shrine to Pan, for instance, would be a place where Romans would do sort of naughty Pan things, I'm thinking. And also, there's something deeply wrong about this altar. Now, it's beautiful. You can tell it was magnificent, it was huge, but there's something deeply fake about it, deeply wrong about it, and deeply cynical about it, which also makes it curious that Jesus would be here, or at least even walking by here. This altar, Tel Omrit, this altar was built by Herod the Great, and it was built to honor the emperor of the world, Caesar Augustus, hailing him and his family as a god. So you've got the same Herod who styled himself king of the Jews, And that was his title, his official title, which has some irony, right? The sign above Jesus' head on Good Friday said King of the Jews. You had Herod, who proclaimed himself king of all Judea, the king of the Jews, and he also even gave the Hebrew people a temple in Jerusalem that would wow them and be the wonder of the ancient world, a place where they could go 3 times a year to worship God Almighty, a house where God lived. And yet here in the north, about 25, 30 miles north of the Galilee, heading up into this different tectonic plate, this different land, if you will, headed up there is an altar to Caesar Augustus as a god, which reveals the cynicism of their day, remembering that Galileans tried to differentiate themselves and to stay apart from the Romans, and yet here you've got their own king selling out to the Romans, Herod pleasing his masters and building an altar to their emperor as a god. Can you see now how wrong it is and how mixed up it is and how blended it is in a world where the starting point was supposed to be different in the way that the Bible asks them to be different, and yet this altar is not different at all. And it's an excellent backdrop to a question which might lead us to a clue as to why they were there. The question is in Mark chapter 8, beginning with the 27th verse. I'm just going to read a few verses to you and then we can unpack it. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You're the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Who do you say that I am, or who do people say that I am? While looking at this blended altar that blends their cultures in a way they were never supposed to be blended, the King of the Jews selling out to his masters, reminding them all that God is on top in a world of crooks and cheats. They had to have this deep cynicism and this resentment for the way that the world appeared to be all the way around them. So Jesus says, "What have you seen so far?" In effect, right? What have you seen so far? I've dropped out of the sky to proclaim that the kingdom of God is near, that something that you waited for, have been waiting for your entire lives is now true, that you don't have to wait for heaven when you die, you don't have to wait for the day of the Lord to come at the end of time, but heaven is as near as something right under your noses. Healing is possible, miracles are possible, feeding is possible, teaching with authority is possible, all these things. So what do people say that is going on? This is what he's asking. Who do people say that I am? Well, this is their answer. Well, some say you're John the Baptist or perhaps one of the prophets, which is to say that they recognize that Jesus is a hero in the way that they all need heroes. We need heroes in our world today, and so that's why I'm so moved by remembrances thanking our military, and so moved by remembrances thanking our first responders and thanking the people who take care of us because they are our heroes. Our hospital workers in the ICU, they're our heroes. We always look for people that are sacrificing for us and we marvel at their dedication and their commitment for our country, because we need to hold up these role models. We need them, and we need them for our children. And so that's a good start. It's not a bad thing that people think that Jesus is one of the prophets. As a matter of fact, if they think he's a prophet or even John the Baptist, then they think that God is back in living color again and talking to him again in the way that God did back in the olden days of Hebrew Scriptures, which is also to say we read the Bible because we believe if God did something once, God will do it again. But it's here that Jesus turns the lens just a little bit and he asks a question. Okay, that's great. They think I'm a hero. Now, who do you say that I am? And it's here that Peter says something that's more true than he knows. He gets it, but he doesn't get it, right? He doesn't really get it yet, and yet he intuitively knows something is more about Jesus, and he blurts it out, and he says, "You're the Messiah," which means that Jesus is more than a hero, more than the greatest guy that ever lived, more than the smartest guy they've ever met. Rather, Peter is saying here, in the shadow of this sellout altar up in the north of the Galilee, you're a starting point. You are a starting point. I mean, this is what the Messiah means. And as such, then Jesus just goes ahead and unpacks this for them. The horse is out of the barn. You now get who I am. I'm a starting point, so you might as well expect trouble. You might as well expect trouble. There will be pain, there will be death, and there will be betrayal, because that's what always happens in the face of something honest and free. Remember, they lived in a world where the game was rigged for the Romans, and it was a well-oiled machine, and you dare not step out of your lane. And they were about to with Jesus as a starting point. And they should have known, because it was all that way, always that way. Now, remember, this altar reminded them that the Romans were perfectly content to let them have their religion as long as they stayed on top. What happens when you begin to hail Jesus as something more than a prophet, but rather as God, right? Or as Savior, or as King, if you will? Well, they were going to buy some trouble, and they should have known, because it's always been that way. Now, I like to remind you that the people living in the world of Jesus knew the Bible. My friend Idan likes to say that literacy rates were through the roof in a world where you had to read in order to practice your religion, and in order to pray and to study and to learn and to follow. And so they all read the Torah and the Hebrews, rest of the Hebrew scriptures, and they all loved the Bible, and they all knew the stories, and they knew the story of one particular prophet named Jeremiah. I'll show you a picture of Jeremiah from the Sistine Chapel, because he's crying, and Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. He's weeping for a couple of reasons. One, he's weeping because in this anthology of Jeremiah's writings, his words, or speaking God's words, but also an anthology of what happened to him, he's crying over where Jerusalem has lost its way. He's a prophet to Judah. The northern kingdom has disappeared of Israel. This is that period of time where there's only the two tribes in the south with the capital in Jerusalem. His ministry, or his prophecy, spans 5 kings, Josiah to Zedekiah at the end, and the destruction of Jerusalem. So he spans this tragic time. He cries because he sees that it's all about to end. They've lost their way. They followed their neighbors' gods. Remember this differentiation as a starting point? Well, they hadn't done it, and they're following their neighbors to the point that you can't even recognize their kingdom. My pal Idan has explained to me that Canaanite city-states in this part of the world, the Near East, fell under 2 spheres of influence, with Mesopotamia in the north and Egypt in the south. And you can look at the trouble that God's people would fall into whenever they started looking like a Mesopotamian city or an Egyptian city. And the reason for this is because with the Mesopotamian sphere of influence or an Egyptian sphere of influence, it might have plenty of technology, might have good armament, it might have good trade associations, it might have wealth, but they didn't have ethics. The religion of the Bible is a religion of what we do in the here and the now. We American Christians are the ones that sort of mess this up when we figure that faith is just something to get us into heaven when we die. If we're going to live like Bible people, we're going to live in the here and in the now. We're going to do justice now, and we're going to be fair now, and we're going to be faithful now, and we're going to do something with our hands. We're going to pray with our hands and with our feet now. And the people living in Jeremiah's time had just simply stopped looking like that, and so he wept. But he also wept because he got beat up a lot. I mean, it would happen at home in Anatote, but they would conspire against him. It would happen in the court. And then finally, near the very end of the destruction of Jerusalem, the king's court and religious leaders would actually conspire or convince the king to kill Jeremiah. He's been such a downer for them as the Babylonians were coming closer and closer and closer, and the city's destruction became more and more imminent. They wanted him gone, so they decided to throw him into a cistern, which is a water-catching device that catches rainwater so that they can save water. And in a world where water is very rare, cisterns are important technology so that the water that does fall can be saved and stored. And so every structure, every city has got some sort of water source and usually will have a cistern. So they throw him into this thing. hoping that he'll starve so that their hands will be free of innocent blood, that they didn't kill him, which sounds a lot like what happened to Jesus when they hoped that the Romans would do the dirty deed, right, so that their hands would be spared of this man's blood. They throw him down in this hole and wait for him to die. We can read about it in Jeremiah 38, chapter 6. It goes like this. So they took Jeremiah and they threw him into the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the court of the guard, letting Jeremiah down by ropes. Now there was no water in the cistern, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. Some of you know I got to go to Israel for a couple weeks last summer, and it was a remarkable experience because the borders had been closed, opened briefly if you had a letter of acceptance, which I was able to get somehow, and then the borders closed again. So I was happy to be there and lucky to be there, and also quite alone with all these archaeologists who had either time on their hands to give to me or just happy to see someone to talk to while they did their work. And so we were able to do some things that I would have never been able to do, walk into places that would have had 3 hours, 3-hour wait times, this sort of thing, empty churches, empty streets. And one of the great pleasures of this trip was to go to a place called a dig called the City of David, and it is a remarkable place that they're finding new things every day. And this encompasses the oldest part of Jerusalem, David's capital city, if you will, the succession of monarchs there of that kingdom, that palace in the house of David, with the city sort of going down the hill to the pool of Siloam. And so under this, archaeologists are just working, and there are all these signs that say, no entrance and a lock. And, thanks to my friends over there, they were able just to unlock the gate and let me in to see all kinds of marvelous things. And so here's the picture I want to show you. This is a cistern in the palace of the king. It is probable, I would say it's certainly highly possible, if not probable, that this is the cistern that Jeremiah was thrown down into. Now, there's a ladder there now because they're walking up and down and working on it, but you can imagine looking up at that hole and wondering if anybody was ever going to pull you out. I was able to enter the cistern. We believe it's very possibly the cistern of Jeremiah. And if it's not the cistern, it's the same kind of cistern, and it gives you the feel. But we're in the palace of the king, and the scriptures say that this was the cistern of the king's son. And so here he is in the mud, and finally an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official, pulls him out and saves his life, and once again he avoids death. But here's my point. They should have known that if even a prophet would face pain and death, much less someone who claims to be a starting point, a Messiah. So the story of the Hebrews has always been a story of pain when you speak the truth. And yet the story of the Hebrews is also this. Even in the midst of pain, if we feel it, God feels it. And God is always with them. In the case of God's people, the time of Jeremiah, they would experience the exile and the destruction that he foresaw. He promised them that it would come, and it did, but God was with them. And lately, I've been playing around with stories of the Philistines. Remember the neighbors of the Hebrews in the Old Testament? They're always the bad guys. Delilah was a Philistine, and Goliath the giant was a Philistine. And Philistines had scary gods and all this. Well, the Philistines disappeared the same time that God's people were attacked by the Babylonians, meaning that the Babylonians intended to make these cultures disappear. Just take their best and brightest, rip them away, put them far away in Babylon, mix the people up, and then suddenly you've just got a unified Babylonian state with no cultures. So that the miracle, if you will, of God's people is they were able to go to Babylon, and then those who remained behind also were able to continue to differentiate as their starting point, continue to keep their identity, to keep their culture, and even way out in exile, God called them a prophet, Ezekiel, and also through a prophet named Jeremiah, promises that they would go home. They would go home. And so while they were in exile, they experienced hope, and they wrote down their scriptures, and they taught their children, and one day they got to go back. In the case of Jesus, as he promised, there would be pain, there would be betrayal, there would be death, but on 3 days, he would rise again. In the case of Jesus, there would be resurrection. In our last episode, we talked about Jesus removing impurities or things that would keep us from God. And so an old woman with a fever represented something that was holding her back from union with God and each other. Death was the ultimate impurity for people living in the world of Jesus. Bones and bodies and things were to be avoided because they would defile you ritually. You wouldn't be able to pray fully or to be around people in a fully in that way. So graveyards were to be avoided, or graves were to be avoided, or at least treated very carefully for a period of purification. And yet with the resurrection of Jesus, even the bones now are made clean. There's nothing that will keep us from the love of God. But if you look at the pattern of the Bible, it says this again and again and again. If you speak the truth and you do right and you're different in the way that God asks you to be different, you will invite trouble. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. God is always with you, and you will go home. Okay, so that's getting us towards a lesson that Jesus perhaps used while looking at an altar that's supposed to be an altar, right? Well, not supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a Roman altar, but it's built by Herod the Great, which means that it's all blended in their religion, and it's just as egregious as something that Jeremiah would have seen. So that gives us a little depth of understanding of the question, who do people say that I am, perhaps? But it doesn't answer this. Why were they there? I want to remind you where I started when we began this podcast, which is they didn't go to these places. They tried to stay away from these places and different from these places. But why would Jesus take his friends to Caesarea Philippi, which gets right by us as a Bible-sounding name, but is actually a Roman place to the core and a place where nice Jewish boys shouldn't be? I'll show you a picture of this shrine to Pan. It's up against the foothills of Mount Hermon. And I'll tell you, since I've talked about biodiversity and geography, if you will, Mount Hermon is a mountain in the north that sits on three borders today. So there's Lebanon and Syria and Israel, with Mount Hermon just kind of right there in the point at the top. It's huge. It has snow on it much of the year. It's really the only majestic mountain that they've got. The other mountains, the mountains of Samaria, will be more Appalachian mountains, and Mount Hermon is more like a Rocky Mountain. So it is a mountain, and you can see it from a long way off, especially in the Golan Heights, and it's absolutely stunning. And so this shrine to Pan, Banias, is up against the foothill of Mount Hermon. So that's a good place to start. So it's possible that Jesus and his friends were going to Caesarea Philippi because they were going to the mountain. There are two possible sites for what I'm about to read to you, which is just the next chapter, just a few verses after this question, who do people say that I am? Jesus goes up a high mountain and is transfigured. And there are two possible sites. One of these is Mount Hermon. Let me read the story and then we'll unpack it. It's Mark chapter 9, beginning with the second verse. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly when they looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus. Now, I said to you there are two possible sites for the scene of the Transfiguration. One is Mount Hermon, which would mean that's why, it would answer the question why they were headed into Caesarea Philippi for the Transfiguration. The other is a place called Mount Tabor, which is in the Jezreel Valley down in the lower Galilee. There's some problems with Mount Tabor, but I will tell you that if you take a traditional pilgrimage to the Holy Land, it's very common and very typical for Christian pilgrim groups to take you to Mount Tabor and to claim this as the site of the Transfiguration. In fact, there are old churches up there. There's a Roman Catholic church and an Orthodox church, and then the remnants of a late Roman church. So Christians have been up on Mount Tabor for a long time, claiming that to be the mountain of Transfiguration, but it's got a couple problems. One, it's not a high mountain. It's a bump. I think they call it a monad. It's a rock that sits by itself, and it's cool looking, but it's really not all that high if you want to compare it to Mount Hermon. So it's not a high mountain. Secondly, there are always people on the top of Tabor. probably a military garrison because it's a lookout, kind of looking out over roads, but certainly people living up there. So it'd be hard for Jesus to go up there and glow without anybody looking at him. So Tabor is a problem. I think, and if I've been listening carefully to my archaeologist pals and historians, we think that perhaps Tabor was a convenient spot for Christian pilgrims because it was halfway between Nazareth and Capernaum and gave people a little bit of a Holy Land experience as they traveled between the two, and for that reason became a place of pilgrimage because they didn't really know for certain where it happened. Now let's go back to the other possible site, which is Mount Hermon in the north. One, it's a real mountain. It's a rocky mountain versus an Appalachian hill, if you will. Secondly, Jesus and his friends are already in Caesarea Philippi, which is the location of the foothills of Mount Hermon, so they're already there. And then also something else happened a long time ago. Just like knowing the stories of Jeremiah, for instance, they also know the stories of Abraham and in Genesis. And I want to recap with you what I believe the story of Abraham to be and the point of the story of Abraham. And it's this. In Genesis chapter 12, God asked Abraham to be different than the world around him. Ask him to leave a city, ask him to take care of his family, ask him to be in union with God and with each other and to live a different kind of life. And he promised him that if he would do this, his dreams would come true, which was land to call his own and children to give it to. He had neither when he stepped out in faith. And so in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham walks. Abram is his name at this point. He walks. When you get to Genesis chapter 15, the dream still hadn't come true. And Abram's starting to have a crisis of faith, which continues throughout the story of Genesis and the story of Abraham. He's got to keep walking until God finally keeps his promise, if you will, and which feels like real life to me, right? I mean, we say our prayers, but sometimes we're reminded that God is not some sort of cosmic gumball machine, sort of dialing up what we want when we want it. Sometimes we just got to walk, and we're going to have to wait. And so he goes up to the north in Genesis chapter 14 to fetch his nephew Lot, who's gotten into trouble. And Abram, the story of Abram is just running up and down this land that by the time of Jesus we call Judea, just running up down the middle. So he runs up to the north to a place called Dan and rescues Lot. And after he rescues Lot, he has a dream. He has a dream. It's Genesis chapter 15. God asks him to do some strange things, strange to us, but they're Bronze Age people, not strange to them. Ask him to make a sacrifice, to cut pieces of an animal and birds into two pieces, and then what happens is that God ratifies this covenant. Covenants were relationships that people would have with each other to protect themselves, and what they would do is they would make a covenant, but specifically they would cut a covenant, and it usually involved a scar that someone could see, especially in a world with very little writing. You would cut a covenant with a powerful neighbor so that they would protect you. In the case of Abraham, he would cut the animals in two, and then here we read, and it's Genesis chapter 15 with the 17th verse. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land from the river of the Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. They would have this land as theirs forever. And they too would have a cut that would signify their covenant with God, which would be circumcision. And this would begin the story of God's people, the Hebrews. The night the covenant was cut with God. Smoke, fire, mystery, and it happened. Generations of faithful people have believed that it happened while Abram was in the north. Remember, that happened in Genesis chapter 14. And what's in the north? Mount Hermon. There is a peak in the foothills of Mount Hermon called the Mount of Cleavings, which leads us to a tantalizing possibility. I'm going to ask the question again and I'm going to answer it. Why in the world would Jesus be in a Roman place when he avoided Roman places? Why would Jesus be in the villages of Caesarea Philippi? I believe that it's quite possible that he was there to enact what had happened 1,000 years before, 2,000 years before him. He was there to enact something that happened in Genesis chapter 15 when God came down in smoke and in fire. I believe a new covenant was being ratified with us, that God was touching earth once again, like God touched earth for Abraham, God was touching earth for them in a new covenant. And isn't it remarkable that on the third day, remember we learned about the Bible, trouble comes, God feels it, God's with us. Even on the other side of death itself, there's resurrection. The other side of exile, they go home. And the other side of the grave, we live again. It's this pattern of the Bible again and again. When God raised his son Jesus, he raised him with scars. God can do anything. God's going to raise his son. He could have raised him with a perfect body, not hurt anymore, but he's raised with scars because those scars are the cut of our covenant with God, never to be separated again. So we'll settle with that and see if this doesn't lead us deeper into the mystery of God's yearning for us to be in relationship and in union with God and with each other, but also different in the way the Bible asks us to be different. We'll keep it going. Thanks, friends.